So what do we got? What do we got for you guys here today? We were talking about money, and we did the history of money. We did all this. Okay. So we are going to define this word money to be anything that serves the functions of money, right? And we know that that's undergone big changes over history, particularly in the last 50 years. It's undergone huge changes. And it's going to be clearly very society dependent what kind of things serve as money. So there's not like one size fits all sort of thing. And as you know, society is changing. And so what is money is going to be changing with it. So we had the Bitcoin example, for example, where we're talking about, is that money or not? And that's one of those no right answer, wrong answer things, because anything that serves the functions of money is money in our definition, which you didn't have when you talked about it, but still. And so to some extent, it does serve those functions, and to some extent, it doesn't. So in our society today, a bunch of different things serve these functions. And let me just list a few. Cash, notes, coins, what English language would call money, that serves the medium of exchange. Like you can go out and you can buy stuff with cash. Not every place anymore, but most places will accept cash most of the time these days. Certainly it's better for drug deals than many other forms of payment, but it's worse for some other things. But you can pay in cash, and so it's clearly serving the medium of exchange. You can, in fact, use it, and it's used typically sort of as a unit of account. Right, when you're comparing prices, you're doing it in euros, and you're kind of in your head thinking cash when you're doing that. So it's serving the functions of money. It's money. Another thing that serves the functions of money is a checking account balance. Right? If you have money in your checking account and you want to go out and buy a cup of coffee after class, you can go over there, you go ping, and then you got the thing. Right? So people will take that direct transfer from your checking account to their checking account and use that as money. So no cash is involved in that whole thing, but you can still buy stuff, right? And so checking account balances are serving as a medium of exchange in our society these days. It was not always the case. When I was young, back in the midst of time, only businesses had checking accounts, at least in Oregon where I was, right? So only businesses had them, and you kind of had to be known by the guy, and they wouldn't accept your check everywhere. And so if you wanted to go out to, say, 7-Eleven and buy a big gulp, which I did, you couldn't really pay by check. It wasn't a thing, and so checking account balances weren't really as good at being money as they are now. Now you have money in your checking account, you can buy anything, anytime. You can take a taxi. You can't get on the bus, oddly enough, but you can put up money on your Leap card with your checking account balances, right? So checking account balances are serving as a medium of exchange nowadays in our society. Stocks are ownership in a company, right? And so if you own, say, 10 shares of IBM, you're a part owner of IBM. You're a partner in the whole big enterprise of the whole IBM conglomerate. That's you, an owner, just like any other owner. It's a certificate saying that. Now, for me and you, we don't really use those as a medium of exchange. We do use those, though, as a store of value, right? If you think, I've got some wealth now, I want to save it for 5 years, then I'm going to spend it when I start my own business, you might put that money into stocks and hold those stocks as a store of value. So it is serving some of the functions of money, but it isn't a really good medium of exchange. So we don't really think of it as money kind of quite the same way in our daily life. But companies, they do think of it as money. Right? If Apple Computer decides they want to buy some little startup firm, just $100 million, and they can buy this firm, small change, they do it, and they say, we bought it with cash. But what they actually bought it with is stocks very often. They'll say, well, we got all this stocks of say, General Motors on hand, and we'll give you the stocks. And other companies are willing to accept these stocks, not because they want General Motors stock. They don't want to be owners in General Motors, but they know they can turn around and sell them very easily, right? And so even if they don't want the stock, they'll accept the stock as part of this swap, and big companies do this all the time. And so for big companies, stocks actually are a medium of exchange. And so we're thinking today's economy that we live in, what is money? Well, stocks are actually serving as a medium of exchange in some parts of the economy. And not for me and you, but for big companies, it's fairly usual. Same thing with bonds. Right? Bonds, we know what a bond is. It's an IOU. And typically, we don't put out bonds, but big companies and governments put out bonds. And these get swapped around a lot, but not by you and me, but by pension funds and insurance companies and big companies. And they swap them around, and they use them as a medium of exchange for big purchases. Right? So these also are serving as a medium of exchange in our society. Gold used to be king, used to be money. D&D days, you'd always get the gold from the kobolds, and that worked great. Gold was a thing. It's not so much anymore, though, right? It's not really used in money at our society. So it used to be money, not so much these days. Like if you have gold and you want a cup of coffee this afternoon, it's not so easy to get it, right? Like how are you going to get your gold turned into coffee? Whereas if you had cash, you'd have no problem. Right? So it's clearly not as good as money as kind of cash for us, but it does get used as a medium of exchange sometimes. And some other economies, so more developing countries typically, a lot of people will save in gold. Right? And they'll keep their savings. Turkey, like all the women get gold, and that's their money. It's one of the few things where they get the money and no one else gets a say on it. And so they do a lot of their savings in gold, and they exchange the gold for stuff. Right? And so gold is kind of a medium of exchange sometimes. Not as often, but it is a thing. Comic books. I will claim that comic books are money. Not so much to me and you, but I remember when I was young, 8, 9 to 13, all my friends were into comic books. I wasn't so much into the comic books, but all my friends were into comic books, and people would accept comic books as swaps. And people would accept comic books that they already have as part of a swap because they knew they could pass it on to somebody else. So for a kid, comic books can be money. They can be used as a medium of exchange. You can be accepting them even when you don't want the thing because you know you can pass it on. I don't know you. I'm going to say not for you and me. Maybe for you. I don't know. Not for me so much. I don't use comic books as money. But people do. Not lots of people, but 10-year-olds count. They're people-ish. And so in our society, comic books are money. It's not very commonly used as money, but it in fact does serve the functions of money, and so therefore it is money. And you can see from this little ramble that kind of everything is money, right? These definitions are so extremely broad that there is kind of no way that there's anything that isn't serving one of these functions. Can you store value in it? Yeah, you probably can, like almost everything. Right? Not, milk. Milk is not a great store of value, but other things, most things can be used as a store of value. Most things, somewhere, sometime, somebody's using it as part of a swap where they don't want the thing, so it's serving as a medium of exchange. Unit of account, we've pretty much settled on euros, but if you are in the, for example, petroleum industry, you might have a particular sort of grade of coal tar that you use as your unit of account when you're doing big swaps. Right? It's not always in terms of euros. It can be anything. Right? Okay? Not so common, but it does happen. So everything is money, which is why when the anthropologist in my anthropology class, she said that there are societies that don't have money. Well, we've defined money so broadly that that's almost impossible to even imagine how you could have a society where nothing is money. Like, is there nothing that is a store of value in that society? Honestly, nothing that they use to store value? Like when they find something, it's just inconceivable, right? Something's going to be storing value, otherwise everyone dies in the winter. So clearly they have a store of value, ergo they have money. We've just defined money so broadly that everything is money. Okay? Which is not super useful, but it is sort of important to realize. Okay? And then we can make it a little more useful by saying, okay, everything's money, but I've made a dumb list, and clearly some of those things are better at being money than others. right? And I have, of course, put them in an order. I put them in order in kind of things that are better at being money towards the top, and things that are in our society worse at being money farther down. And in fact, cows can be money too. Hey, what do we got? So what I've done is I've ordered them in what we call liquidity. So I put things, can we get a little thing that says liquidity somewhere? Okay. So we are going to focus, when we say something is better at being money than something else, we're going to focus in particular on the medium of exchange function. And you'll notice, because my slides are not in my head, that a lot of the things that I say are better at being money up here are things that we find very easy to pass on, like cash or checking account balances. It's quite easy to buy a cup of coffee with them. If you've got a cow, it's less easy to buy a cup of coffee. And so it's sort of easier to spend the things at the top than it is at the bottom. They are sort of better at being at the medium of exchange. But as you go down, things are actually getting better as a store of value, by and large, right? If you have cash, we got 8% inflation these days, it's losing value every year. If you keep all your wealth in cash, then at the end of the year, you're going to have 8% less spending power than you did at the beginning. So that's a problem. But if you instead bought bonds and saved it all in terms of Irish government IOUs, for instance, then it would earn interest, and you would do better than holding it in terms of cash. So as we go down, generally speaking, these tend to be better stores of value than the things at the top. And yet I'm going to say the things at the top are kind of better at being money. And that's because we're focusing mostly on the medium of exchange function. And the reason we're doing that is not necessarily because it's more important. For example, those guys in Brazil, when they were trying to stabilize the real from the podcast, they were using the unit of account function of money to try to anchor everyone's belief in that currency before they introduced the currency. And so there, the unit of account function was the really important one that they used to stabilize the economy. Okay, so it's not that these other ones are unimportant, but for the kind of stories we're going to tell and the kind of things that we're going to be using our definition of money for, the medium of exchange is going to be what we're going to be focusing on, the story that we're going to be telling. So when we think about what is good at being money and what is bad at being money, we're going to focus on the medium of exchange function, just because that's what we're going to be using it for in our stories. And so that's what we want to focus our attention on. Okay, so I've ordered them in terms of liquidity. And if you think about liquid, the thing about liquid is if you try to pick it up, it runs through your fingers, right? Just like money. If you try to hold on to your money, you'll find it's gone, because it's very liquid. It just means easy to spend. So an asset that is really liquid is very easy to spend. So if you have cash, that's pretty easy to spend. If you have checking account balances, that's pretty easy to spend. These are very liquid assets. If you have comic books, you might have a lot of wealth in comic books, but it is not as easy to spend them. It is less liquid of an asset. You got to go to some comic book convention in New Orleans or someplace and find some other guy who wants to buy your comic books and all that. It's a whole rigmarole to get rid of your comic books, to get good value for them anyway. Whereas if you just had that same wealth in terms of cash, you could spend it really easily. Okay, so we would say that cash is more liquid than comic books. And so in our society, in my vague feeling, I thought the things at the top of the list were more liquid than the things down at the bottom of the list. Okay. So we're going to say those things that are liquid are better at being money than the things that are less liquid. Okay. And so there's some standard definitions, and you shouldn't take these too seriously in the sense that this is, like central banks are institutions that we're going to put in control of our money supply in a way that 3 lectures from now you'll know. But their job is to keep track of how much money is out there and to influence how much money is out there. Okay. And so clearly they would like to know how much money is out there. So they would like to measure the amount of money that's out there as they do this job. And so there's some standard definitions. And students want to memorize this, and I'm not going to put all the details of them because there's more details to them, but just to get you a feeling of how these measurements work. So we're going to have various definitions of money. We're going to have very liquid things. We're going to have less liquid things and less liquid things. So different definitions depending on what level of liquidity you're trying to capture in your thing. And we're going to, in practice, try to measure how much of that kind of liquidity is out there. Okay. So M0 is stuff that's really easy to spend. And so this is just notes and coins. Okay. M0 is what English language would call money. Okay? It is interesting that this does not include checking account balances, right? Because this definition was made up in the distant past. I think post-war sometime they started measuring this stuff, but it's at least 50 years old, and I think older. And so back then, notes and coins were really a lot easier to spend than, say, checking account balances. But nowadays, it's actually kind of easier to spend checking account balances than it is to spend notes and coins. Right? Lots of places, not lots, but some places won't accept your notes and coins, or they'll roll their eyes, I got to go to the other cash register and make your change. Could you just go ping like everyone else? What's wrong with you? And so it's easier to spend your checking account balances these days in our society often than it is to spend the notes and coins. So this, as sort of the most liquid, is kind of a holdover from the olden days, the ancient times, when I roamed the earth as a young one. These days, a holdover from then. But it's still around because they like to have measurements of things. But it's just notes and coins. Okay. M1 is traditionally, back in the day, stuff that's just a little less easy to spend. So that's going to include your notes and coins, plus we're going to include checking account balances there. And these days, nobody ever cares about M0. M0 is totally unimportant. We are really going to be much more concerned with M1, the checking account balances plus the notes and coins. Because if you want a cup of coffee, if you've got either one of those, you can buy a cup of coffee after class. And so that's liquid enough that this is what's going to matter for your spending. Right? If you have a pile of comic books, maybe you can't get a cup of coffee after class. But if you got notes, coins, or checking account balances, you're good to go. Coffee is yours. World's your oyster. It's going to be great. Okay. But we don't have to stop there, and indeed we don't, because we cannot be stopped. We can have more M's. We can have M2, and we do. M2 is stuff that's pretty easy to spend. It's M1, so the notes and coins and the checking account balances, plus short-term time deposits. There's a few other things, by the way, that I've left out. Traveler's checks that used to be a big deal, but not really a deal anymore. And there's a few other little things, but this is the basics of what's going on. So M2 includes short-term time deposits. A short-term time deposit is you go to AIB and say, I do not like it that when I put my money in the checking account, you charge me a fee. And then on top of the fee, I have to realize that there's inflation and my money is losing value. I would like to earn interest on my money. And AIB says, another sucker, you're bored every minute. Come on into our office and we will sell you a product. And one of the products they will offer you is put it in this account, and it has to stay in there for, say, 2 weeks, and at least 2 weeks, or it's going to be in there indefinitely. It's going to earn an interest rate. But if you want it back, you have to give us a week's notice. You can't just come and get it anytime you want. You're going to give us a week's notice to get it out. And if you need it quicker than that, we're going to charge you for that. You're either going to lose your interest earnings or you're going to have to pay a fee or something. Right? So it's not as easy to spend. Right? It's not like you can use that money and just go get a cup of coffee because you got to give them a week's notice. And it doesn't help you after class at all. But if you want to buy a car, giving me a week's notice is no big deal. Right? And so it affects some kind of purchases. Right? It's not liquid enough to make these impulse buys, your daily shopping, and that kind of thing. But it is liquid enough to make these bigger purchases where you're going to spend a week thinking about it anyway, so telling them it's going to take a week is not really a big deal. Right? So it's less liquid than M1, but still pretty liquid. And so it depends on what you're trying to analyze, which is the relevant thing. Right? If you're thinking, do people out in the economy have enough liquidity to buy a car? You would really be more interested in M2 than you would be in M1. Right? because it's not a big deal to wait the week to buy the car. But if you're thinking, do people in the economy have enough liquidity to buy sort of impulse buys and go to the movies and whatnot? Well, the short-term time deposits isn't liquid enough for that. You'll be thinking more of M1. Right? So normally we think like consumers' daily life, M1 is more relevant, and sort of longer-term purchases, bigger purchases, would be focused more on M2. But we can continue. We can do M3, we can do M4, we can do M5, and we can do M6, and indeed we do. We can continue all the way up to M25 or M57, I don't know. At some point they stopped counting. And in fact, this counting thing has become less and less of a thing in policy circles anyway. They still keep track of a bunch of these, I think 5 or 6 of them, but just progressively less liquid assets. Right, so you start including stocks and bonds and stuff in there. Mutual funds and stuff like that. Okay? But eventually, if you sort of kept up the exercise, you start getting comic books included in there as well. Right? Everything is money, just some things are better than others, and these are sort of a way to think about what they are in our society today. Okay? For this class, oh yeah?
I'm just wondering, so for example, let's say like there's a huge inflation,
Mm-hmm.
and because of that, even if you have like a bundle of notes and coins,
Mm-hmm.
you cannot buy a piece of bread,
Mm-hmm.
then does that make cash not liquid because you cannot buy bread with it?
So there's 2 issues. It's sort of, is your wealth being eroded, and will people accept it easily? So the liquid is, will they accept it easily, not whether they'll give you a good deal on it, right? So if you can get rid of your wealth and somebody will, sure, I'll take that, no problem, then it's still liquid. But if you have enough inflation, like mid-war Germany, for example, if you have enough inflation, then people don't want this stuff because it's losing value. And then it can become illiquid because people won't accept it because I'd rather have a chicken. At least I can eat the chicken, right? By the time I get around to spend the Deutschmarks, they're not worth anything anyway, so they won't accept it. And so you can have inflation so high that it becomes illiquid, right? So that's entirely possible. It's a good question. Okay. But it's not so much that it's losing value, that you lost half of your value, or 8% of your value by holding it in terms of cash. That's unfortunate for you. It just means it's a bad store of value. But it still might be a good medium of exchange. But if you take it to the extreme, no one's going to accept this thing. And then it becomes a bad medium of exchange as well. Okay. So for the purposes of this class, and most of macroeconomics, we are going to be thinking of M1 as money. Okay? And this is important. This is like, if you kind of miss this, everything will sound nice, everything will sound sensible, everything will be fine, and then towards the end of the chapter, you'll be totally lost because it will make no sense whatsoever. Okay? Because it is so close to the English language definition of money, but it is not the same in an important way. And that important way is, of course, the checking account balances. We are thinking about checking account balances as money. And in fact, when I say money, you should be thinking initially, like almost entirely, checking account balances. You can safely forget about notes and coins. It's a very small percentage of the money. It doesn't feel that way to you because you're students. Maybe you're young and you always use electronic money. You wouldn't know a note if it bit you. I don't know. But back in my day, we always had cash. We had nothing in our checking account balances. We had like $5 in cash, and that was our net wealth. And we walked both ways to school uphill. We did all that stuff. But for us, notes and coins were money. But that is not how you should think about it. Like, what you should think about is, where does that come from? You get paid from your job, right? So how does that end up in your account at the end of the month? Well, the company you work for has to meet all its payroll. And they don't pay out in cash, they pay out in checking accounts. So before the end of the month, they have to have, companies out there, have to have everybody's entire salary in the bank. That's a checking account balance. And so people do have notes and coins in their pockets, but maybe they got 100, maybe they're rich, they got 300 in their pocket. But they don't have the 2,000 that's coming in the pay packet. And that's all in checking account balances. So when you hear the word money, you should be thinking checking account balances. You can forget about notes and coins. They are absolutely unimportant for any of the stories we're going to tell. They're there. Now, you can get a note and coin, but it's not what really is driving money. The vast majority of the money in the money supply is checking account balances. Okay, I've got to let you go. One thing I will say is that we've left out a few things, and you can think about this on, what about if you have, for example, a Visa card with a 2,000 euro limit? Is that money? There's nothing got done, like it's not anyone paid you that, but someone said, I'm willing to loan you 2,000 euros whenever you want. Well, what that means is that if you want a cup of coffee after class, you can use that 2,000 euros that you don't have to buy a cup of coffee. So it is a form of liquidity that you can spend wealth based on that Visa card. So maybe in M1 we should also be including Visa card, not balances, but Visa card limits in there. Okay? And this is like a huge sort of debate in macroeconomics about what we should include in money for what purpose. Like lots of things that aren't really like money in the natural sense, like Visa card limits, that kind of serving as money as well. Okay, I'll let you go. Punchline is bank account balances are money.